Okay, just before I start, a quick introduction. I will be defending side opposition. Here are a couple list of arguments for each side just for this hypothetical debate. The first for side proposition is the idea of freedom of speech because you increase freedom of speech for different writers if you encourage them by publishing whatever material. The second is that you introduce people to newer ideals. And the third is that this can lead to an encroachment on what is considered offensive literature. Example is that things like democracy were considered radical for their time. The second, for opposition, the three arguments here are: first is the freedom of speech for the publisher gets encroached upon. The second is that their mental health gets ruined because if they distribute deeply offensive literature, then it harms their personal connections. And the third is it allows publishers to be targeted in autocratic regimes that find that offensive literature goes against whatever they state. Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. Time will start on my first word. As it was evidently clear in the first half of the op block, both sides heavily agree on the principles of freedom being a driving factor in the determination of the House's judgment. The question here is to what extent should that principle be justified in making that decision? Side proposition claims that it should be the primary thing because this is a beliefs motion. Therefore, beliefs or principles should come first, with the House being a moral society. Side opposition, since the one, claims that beliefs ought to be derived from consequence, i.e., we know that killing is bad because of the consequence of death, which is why it is necessary to examine the consequences of the policy action in order to determine its morality. In that sense, we should also be able to weigh different consequences of actions. For example, we know that an action is more immoral if it results in death or if it just results in a small scar that is not harmful. Almost all of side proposition's substantive arguments have consequences that are very minimal and impact out to just principles, like democracy ruining democratic ideals, or overall ruining the idea of freedom of speech. On the other hand, one argument which has gone fundamentally uncontested is the argument on mental health. Proposition's argument in the two is that this is rhetoric used to exclude different ideologies and is pretty much unfounded. However, proposition ignored the two links about how publishers are obligated to publish offensive literature. They are forced to break ties with their families who might be offended by the literature that they publish. The second is that in autocratic regimes like North Korea, if a publisher is morally obligated to publish a literature that goes against the regime, then he is systematically targeted, which fundamentally breaks down his mental health because he is put to either execution or put in a jail cell, which definitely ruins one's mental health. This comes first on the House's consideration, because death from mental health, which can result from terrible things such as self-harm, is irreversible and has the worst impact on the scale of severity. Concepts like freedom of speech and democracy can all be fought for and can be reversed when they are in danger, which is just proven from the large amounts of revolutionary ideals that we have seen in the past. However, a human life unfortunately cannot. Which is why the House's primary consideration in making this decision should be which side saves the most amount of human lives. When we obligate and morally obligate publishers to publish offensive literature which would ruin their mental health, then clearly the answer is that you should never partake in passing this resolution. But even if you believe side proposition's argument that freedom should be the primary factor of consideration, then you should still vote for side opposition, because forcing an obligation amongst publishers is a fundamental breach of their freedom of speech. This outweighs because writers have alternate methods of actively expressing themselves. For example, they can go out and write in a forum. Second, they can go on social media, which is becoming a lot more bigger right now. Third, they have the opportunity of finding multiple different publishers to express their ideals from. One publisher who might find one thing offensive, who might be in their specific situation in a country that is autocratic, would reject that specific writer. However, a publisher in a more safe democratic country who does not feel their life is being threatened would be significantly more accepting to that specific writer. On the other hand, the publisher's only method of expressing themselves is through the amount of publishing. There is no other way. Either they publish that writer's work or they don't. Which is why, for that multitude of obligations, that you should always prioritize the idea of saving the freedom of speech of the publisher. At the end of the day, we always try to look at the benefits that a writer faces when a publisher publishes the work, but never the harm that the publisher faces that happens when you publish offensive pieces of literature, which is why we are so proud to oppose.